The wrench slipped from Victor's hand, clanging against the concrete floor of his tiny auto repair shop. He let out a tired sigh, rubbing his greasy hands against the worn-out rag in his pocket. It was another long day, another pile of bills waiting for him at home, and another moment of wondering how much longer he could keep the shop running. Victor had inherited the place from his late father, a man who had built this shop from the ground up with nothing but determination and a love for fixing things. But times were different now. Business was slow, and with the rise of bigger, flashier repair shops in town, customers weren't exactly lining up at his door. Just as he was about to close up for the evening, a car sputtered to a stop right in front of his shop. The sleek black sedan looked expensive, but it was clear something was wrong with it. The engine made a terrible rattling noise before shutting off completely. Victor wiped the sweat off his forehead and stepped outside. A woman stepped out of the car, frustration etched across her face. She was well-dressed, her fitted blazer and heels standing out against the dusty pavement of the small town street. She looked around, clearly annoyed, before locking eyes with Victor. "Is this your shop?" she asked, her voice carrying just a slight edge of impatience. "Yeah," Victor replied, glancing at the car. "Sounds like your engine's in bad shape. Want me to take a look?" The woman sighed, crossing her arms. "I'd appreciate it. It just started making this noise an hour ago. I have a meeting in the city tomorrow morning, so I really need it fixed." Victor nodded. "Pop the hood. I'll see what I can do." She hesitated for a moment before giving him a small nod. "Thank you. I'm Laura, by the way." "Victor," he replied, already diving under the hood. The engine was a mess. Whoever had serviced this car before had done a poor job. Loose wires, a clogged filter, and an oil leak. Fixing this would take hours, and from the looks of it, Laura had no idea how bad the damage was. "How long will it take?" she asked, standing beside him. Victor straightened up, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Honestly, it's not a quick fix. I can have it running by tomorrow afternoon, but it needs a lot of work." "Tomorrow afternoon?" Laura frowned. "That's cutting it close." Victor could tell she was calculating something in her head, possibly weighing her options. He expected her to ask about the cost. Most people did, but she surprised him. "All right," she said. "Do whatever you need to do." Victor raised an eyebrow. "You don't want an estimate first?" She shook her head. "I just need it fixed as soon as possible." Victor hesitated. He was barely scraping by, and this car would take up most of his night. But something about the situation told him this wasn't just about a meeting. There was something else in her eyes. Stress, maybe even exhaustion. "Tell you what," he said, making a decision before he could talk himself out of it. "I'll fix it for free." Laura blinked. "What? I mean it. I'll take care of it." She tilted her head, studying him. "Why would you do that?" Victor shrugged. "You look like you've got enough on your plate. I'm not about to make it worse. Besides, I grew up in a place where people helped each other out when they could." For the first time since she arrived, Laura's hardened expression softened. She looked at him like she was trying to figure him out, like she wasn't used to people doing things without expecting something in return. "You sure?" she asked. "Yeah," Victor said, pulling his cap lower over his forehead. "Consider a favor." Laura exhaled, nodding slowly. "I appreciate that more than you know." Victor didn't ask what she meant. Instead, he got to work. As the hours passed, Laura didn't leave. She sat on a bench outside the shop, watching him work, occasionally asking questions about what he was doing. Victor explained in simple terms, surprised that she actually seemed interested. "You always wanted to be a mechanic?" she asked at one point. Victor chuckled. "Didn't have much of a choice. My dad owned the shop. I grew up around cars. It was either this or..." He didn't finish the sentence. Laura nodded, watching as he tightened a bolt. "You're good at it." Victor smirked. "Thanks." By the time the sun started to rise, Victor had finally gotten the engine running smoothly again. He wiped his hands, exhaustion settling in, but there was a deep satisfaction in knowing he had done something good. Laura stood up, stretching. "I don't know how to thank you." Victor shrugged. "Just drive safe." She hesitated for a moment before pulling out a business card from her pocket. If you ever need anything, call me. Victor took the card but barely glanced at it before slipping it into his pocket. He had no idea who she really was. No idea that their paths were about to cross again in a way he never expected. Victor hadn't thought much about the encounter after Laura drove off. He had too many other things to worry about. Keeping the lights on in the shop, figuring out how to cover next month's rent, and making sure his old truck didn't break down on him again. He hadn't even looked at the business card she gave him, which was still tucked in the pocket of his work jeans. It wasn't that he wasn't curious, but he didn't expect to see her again. But 3 days later, she returned. It was late afternoon when the same sleek black sedan pulled up in front of the shop. Victor was under the hood of an old pickup, replacing a faulty alternator, when he heard the tires crunch against the gravel outside. He glanced up, surprised to see Laura stepping out, this time in a more casual outfit, a simple blouse and slacks instead of the sharp business attire from before. He wiped his hands on a rag as she approached, her expression unreadable. "Did something go wrong with the car?" he asked, half expecting her to tell him he'd missed something in the repairs. She shook her head. "No, it's running perfectly. That's why I'm here." Victor raised an eyebrow. "You came all the way back just to tell me that?" Laura hesitated for a moment, as if considering how much to say. "Came back because I wanted to know why you did it. Why you fixed my car without asking for anything." Victor leaned against the workbench, folding his arms. "Told you. I grew up in a place where people helped each other when they could. You look like you needed a break." She studied him, her sharp gaze searching for something. "You don't know anything about me. For all you knew, I could have been some rich executive who wouldn't think twice about paying." Victor shrugged. "Doesn't matter. You needed help. That was enough." Laura exhaled, shaking her head slightly. "People don't just do things like that. Not without expecting something in return." Victor let out a small chuckle. "Maybe not where you're from." She didn't argue with that. Instead, she pulled out her phone, tapping on the screen before looking back at him. "How's business?" she asked. Victor hesitated. He wasn't the type to complain about his struggles, especially to someone he barely knew. But there was something direct about Laura, something that made it clear she wasn't just making small talk. "It's tough," he admitted. "Not a lot of people coming through these days. Big shops are taking most of the customers. I get by, but barely." Laura nodded, as if she had already guessed that. "Have you ever thought about expanding? Getting more equipment? Hiring help?" Victor let out a dry laugh. "You need money to do that." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she glanced around the shop, taking in the worn tools, the outdated equipment, the faded sign above the entrance. Then she turned back to him. "What if I told you that you could change all of this?" she asked. Victor frowned. "What do you mean?" Laura glanced at her phone again before slipping it back into her pocket. "I want to show you something, if you have time." Victor debated for a moment. He had another car to look at, a few calls to make, but something about the way she said it made him curious. "All right," he said. "Where are we going?" She gestured to her car. "You'll see." Victor wasn't sure what he was getting himself into, but he grabbed his jacket, locked up the shop, and got into the passenger seat of her car. They drove out of town, heading toward the outskirts, where the landscape opened up into stretches of undeveloped land. Victor had lived here his whole life, but he rarely had a reason to come out this way. After about 15 minutes, Laura pulled into a long driveway leading to a large building. Victor glanced at her. "What is this place?" he asked. She parked and turned off the engine before looking at him. "It's a facility I invested in last year, a startup that specializes in automotive technology." Victor blinked. "Wait, you invested in this?" She nodded, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "I invest in a lot of things. This is just one of them." For a moment, Victor wasn't sure what to say. He had assumed she was just another professional passing through town, maybe someone with a decent job in the city. But this was something else entirely. Laura got out of the car, and Victor followed her toward the building. Inside, the facility was sleek and modern, with engineers working on various projects, advanced engines, diagnostic systems, even a prototype for an electric vehicle. Victor had never seen anything like it. "I wanted to show you this because I see potential in you." Laura said as they walked past a workstation where a group of mechanics were testing a new engine model. You have skill, Victor. And you have something a lot of people in business forget about: integrity. Victor rubbed the back of his neck, feeling slightly overwhelmed. I appreciate that, but I don't see what this has to do with me. Laura stopped and turned to face him. It has everything to do with you. I don't just invest in businesses. I invest in people. And I think you have the ability to do more than just scrape by in that little shop of yours. Victor frowned. You're saying you want to invest in me? She nodded. But I need to know if you're ready for it. Victor wasn't sure how to respond. He had spent so much time just trying to survive that the idea of someone offering him a chance at something bigger felt almost impossible. I don't know, he admitted. I've been doing things my way for so long. It's hard to imagine anything different. Laura gave him a small smile. Think about it. No pressure. But if you ever decide you're ready, I can help you turn that shop into something more. Victor didn't know what to say. He had come here expecting nothing more than a conversation, but now he was standing in the middle of a state-of-the-art facility being offered an opportunity he had never even considered. As they drove back to town, he thought about his father, about the years spent keeping the shop running, about the feeling of fixing something with his own hands. Could he really take a step toward something bigger? He wasn't sure yet, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like there was a possibility. Victor had always been a man who trusted his hands more than words, but Laura's offer lingered in his mind like a stubborn bolt refusing to loosen. That night, he sat in his small apartment, staring at the business card she had given him. He finally turned it over, revealing a company name he vaguely recognized from the news. It wasn't just any investment firm. It was a major player. He had spent years keeping his father's shop afloat, fighting off the weight of overdue bills and dwindling customers. The thought of expansion had never crossed his mind, not because he didn't want it, but because it felt impossible. Yet here was someone telling him he had potential, that she saw something in him worth backing. The next morning, Victor arrived at the shop earlier than usual. The scent of motor oil and old metal was comforting, grounding him as he moved through his routine. He tried to focus on the job in front of him, an old sedan with a failing transmission, but his mind kept drifting back to Laura's words. Late in the afternoon, the bell over the shop's entrance jingled. Victor glanced up, expecting a customer, but it was Laura again, this time carrying 2 cups of coffee. She offered one to him without a word. He took it, mumbling a quiet thanks before setting down his wrench. You're still thinking about it, she observed. Victor nodded. It's not an easy decision. I would expect it to be. She leaned against the workbench. But I can tell you're not the kind of person to ignore an opportunity just because it's unfamiliar. Victor exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. It's not just about me. This shop was my dad's. He built it from nothing. I don't want to turn it into something he wouldn't recognize. Laura studied him for a moment before speaking. You're not abandoning his legacy by growing. You're honoring it by making sure it survives. That settled something deep in Victor's chest, though he wasn't ready to admit it yet. Laura didn't push him further. Instead, she changed the subject, asking about the cars he had worked on over the years, the strangest repairs he'd ever done. They talked for a while, the conversation flowing easily. As she was about to leave, she paused by the door. Have a meeting in the city tomorrow. I want you to come with me. Victor frowned. What kind of meeting? She hesitated as if choosing her words carefully. Let's just say it's with someone who believes in investing in skilled tradesmen. I think you should meet them. Victor wasn't sure why, but he nodded. All right. The next day, Victor found himself in a part of the city he rarely visited. The towering glass buildings, the polished streets. Everything felt a world away from the grease-stained floors of his shop. Laura led him into an office that overlooked the skyline. Inside, a man in his 50s greeted them. He introduced himself as Richard, a longtime associate of Laura's. Richard didn't waste time on small talk. Laura tells me you run a repair shop, that you've kept it going despite the odds. Victor nodded, unsure where this was going. Richard leaned forward. Started out in a small garage, just like you. Built my first business from the ground up. I know what it's like to struggle, to wonder if you'll make it another month. Victor listened carefully. Richard continued, I invest in businesses that have heart, ones that are run by people who don't just see numbers, but people. Laura glanced at Victor before adding, That's why I brought you here. I wanted you to hear from someone who's been where you are. Victor took a deep breath. I appreciate that, but I'm not sure I'm the kind of guy investors look at. Richard smiled. That's where you're wrong. The best investments aren't just about money. They're about trust. And from what Laura tells me, you've already proven you're someone worth trusting. Victor didn't know what to say. It was a lot to take in. As they left the office, Laura looked over at him. You don't have to decide now, but know this. Opportunities like this don't come around often. Victor nodded slowly. He knew that, and for the first time, he was seriously considering what it would mean to say yes. Victor sat in the passenger seat of Laura's car as they drove back from the city, his thoughts a tangled mess. The meeting with Richard had been unexpected, and the weight of it pressed against his chest. He had spent so many years keeping his father's shop afloat, never once considering that someone might see value in what he was doing. Now, for the first time, someone was offering him a chance to grow, to take his business beyond just surviving. Laura kept her eyes on the road, giving him space to process everything. The city skyline faded in the rearview mirror, replaced by the familiar roads leading back to town. Victor glanced out the window, the passing scenery soothing in its familiarity. You're quiet, Laura finally said. He exhaled, rubbing his palms together. Just thinking. She nodded, as if she expected that. I know it's a lot. He turned to her. Why are you doing this? Laura didn't answer right away. She slowed the car as they approached a red light, then finally said, Because you helped me when you didn't have to. You had no idea who I was, but you still chose to do the right thing. That's rare. Victor shook his head slightly. I didn't do it expecting anything in return. I know, she said simply. The light turned green, and they continued down the road. Victor drummed his fingers against his knee, his mind circling the same question over and over. Was he really ready for this? They pulled up to his shop, the familiar sight grounding him. Laura parked but didn't turn off the engine. I won't push you, she said, but I believe in investing in people who deserve it. And you deserve this. Victor studied her, searching for any sign that this was some kind of trick, but all he saw was sincerity. She reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope, placing it on the console between them. What's this? He asked, hesitating before picking it up. Consider it a starting point, she said. Something to help you breathe a little easier. Victor opened the envelope, his breath catching when he saw the check inside. The number stared back at him, $25,000. His hands tightened around the paper. This is too much, he whispered. She shook her head. It's exactly what you need. You can use it however you see fit. Pay off debts, upgrade your shop, hire help. It's your choice. Victor swallowed hard, struggling to find the right words. He had spent years scraping by, counting every dollar, worrying about how he would keep the doors open. Now, in his hands was an opportunity to finally change that. Why me? He asked, his voice quieter now. Laura gave him a knowing look. Because the world needs more people like you. Victor sat there for a long moment, staring down at the check. The weight of the paper felt heavier than it should have. Finally, he looked up, meeting her gaze. I don't know how to thank you. Laura smiled. Just make the most of it. Victor nodded slowly, still feeling the shock settle in his bones. He had never imagined that fixing a stranger's car for free would lead to something like this. As he stepped out of the car, he turned back to Laura. I won't waste this. I know you won't, she said before driving off. Victor stood outside his shop, the check still gripped in his hands. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to believe in: hope. Victor sat in his shop long after Laura had driven away, staring at the check in his hands. The weight of it was more than just the paper. It was the possibility it represented. For years, he had pushed forward without expecting a break, without daring to hope for real change. Now, change was sitting right in front of him, waiting for him to decide what to do with it. He thought about his father, about the long nights they had spent in this very shop, covered in grease, working side by side. His father had built this place from the ground up, never asking for handouts, never walking away from a challenge. Victor had followed in those footsteps, but now he wondered if holding on to the past too tightly had kept him from moving forward. The next morning, he made a decision. Instead of heading straight to work, he drove to the nearest bank. The teller glanced at the check, eyes widening slightly before processing the deposit. Victor felt his chest tighten as the transaction was completed. It was real. The money was his to use, but more than that, it was a new beginning. Back at the shop, he pulled out a notepad and started listing everything that needed to change. The tools that had long since needed replacing, the parts he had put off ordering, the upgrades that could make repairs faster and more efficient. But the biggest change he wanted, hiring help. He had been running the shop alone for too long. If he wanted to grow, he needed people he could trust. That afternoon, he put up a simple sign outside. Now hiring, mechanic wanted. The response was quicker than he expected. By the next day, a young man named Daniel walked into the shop, resume in hand. He had just finished his training at a technical school and was eager to get hands-on experience. Victor liked his energy, his willingness to learn. After a short conversation, he offered Daniel the job on the spot. With an extra set of hands, things started to shift almost immediately. Work that used to take Victor days was now done in half the time. Customers noticed the improvement. Word spread. Within a month, the change was undeniable. The shop was busier than it had been in years. Regular customers started bringing in referrals. A local business owner with a fleet of vans asked if Victor could handle their maintenance. For the first time, he didn't have to turn work away. One evening, as he locked up for the night, Laura's car pulled up again. She stepped out, looking around the shop with approval. "I see you put the money to good use," she said, glancing at the new tools, the improved workspace, and the sign that now read, Victor's Auto Repair, now accepting fleet accounts. Victor nodded. "I did, and I owe you for that." She shook her head. "You did this yourself. I just gave you a push." He leaned against the door frame, arms crossed. "Still, I appreciate it." She gave him a knowing look. "Then make me a promise." "What kind?" "Make a promise that when someone else needs a push, you'll do the same for them." Victor considered that for a moment. He thought about Daniel, about the way he had needed someone to take a chance on him. He thought about the customers who had come in, struggling with car trouble they couldn't afford to fix, and how he had quietly helped when he could. Finally, he nodded. "Yes, I can do that." Laura seemed satisfied with that answer. She didn't stay long, just long enough to see that her investment had made a difference. As she drove away, Victor stood outside his shop, watching the taillights disappear. He had spent years believing that hard work was enough, that if he just kept going, things would work out. But now he understood something else. Sometimes the right opportunity could change everything. And if you were lucky, you could be that opportunity for someone else. As he turned off the lights and headed home, Victor knew this was only the beginning. But for the first time in a long time, he was ready for whatever came next.